Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. And I'm thrilled to have Laurette Foggini,
Bravo.
who we have some similarities in terms of our story. Longtime Bay Area residents, and then heading back east to care for parents. And I'll wait to get into that, and we'll let Laurette get into that a little bit more. At a high level, Laurette grew up on Long Island, headed out to San Francisco, and her professional life is very interesting, and I'll let her get into that as well. And one of the reasons we're here today with you is that she has a background with a company called Home Care Assistance and also Home Instead. And she's transitioned to caring for her mom, yet also trying to keep a career alive. And she's been doing that by writing books, and you can see behind her. She'll talk a little bit more about Lola, and as well as an independent geriatric care manager. And I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to let Laurette get into this.
Okay.
So, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start out. So you've worked in the caregiving patient advocacy industry for years, I think upwards of 14 years.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you did during those 14 years and your contact at that point on the outside looking in with caregivers and patient advocates?
Sure. So I got into it by chance. I did not think I was going to get into the elder care industry. I didn't study geriatrics in school, but I was a volunteer. And one of the things I volunteered in was visiting seniors in a community called Laguna Honda, which was low income. And I used to go there with my son and just loved going there and just brightening everyone's day. And he was a toddler at the time. And it was a wonderful experience. And then one day my neighbor said, I'm looking for someone like you to join me at Home Instead and do some community outreach. And I said, well, what does Home Instead do? I had no idea that this was actually an industry. So she explained it, and I said, well, you get paid for it? I've been doing this as a volunteer. So I got into it by chance through that avenue. And what I did for Home Instead and then moved on to Home Care Assistance was we would work with families that were at the point of considering to get care in the home, or they needed to bring care into a community where their parents lived, but they needed more hands-on care. So I started off in community outreach, which is more like business development, and then moved into the client care part of it, which was really the part of meeting the families, talking about their situation, developing care plans, and then finding the right caregiver to match what their needs were, what their personality was, and then managing that process, because it's a very human intensive business, and it rarely goes smoothly. And I did that for several years, and then ended up growing an office and then managing a region and training other people to do the same. So we really focused on families that were going to take that plunge into hiring private care, but of course was exposed to a lot of different aspects of what you needed to do to work with your parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, family members who are aging.
So at that point, from the outside looking in, before you even thought about being a caretaker, what was your view of caregivers and caregiving and patient advocacy?
So, I mean, one of the things that I realized very quickly is how many things could go wrong. And also how difficult it was, just that small part of the elder care journey, how complicated it could actually be. So that was a very quick message. I came in all like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and, went around saying, we have the best caregivers here because we care, and we did care, but it's a very difficult industry to find consistent caregivers who, will work for short shifts. Some families needed short shifts and we just didn't have them. And they would say to me, well, it's an easy shift because all you have to do is be mom's friend. And then by the end of my time in this industry, I'd say, no, that's the most difficult shift, actually. Because, caregivers they need to make money as much as they care about people. They need to make money, and they don't make money on those types of shifts. So it was a pretty quick and rude awakening when I was meeting with families and we couldn't match what they needed. So I learned quickly the complexities of that working in the industry. And really what happened for me is I made the shift of, instead of going around saying we have the best caregivers, is really educating families on what could go wrong. I hated the idea of going in and promising them that everything would be fine now that they signed up with an agency, when really you can't just wash your hands of it. I mean, as you know very well, you could get great people to come in. It may not last. It may last. It may not, it may not work for either party. So there's a lot of hand-holding that needs to happen. And that's why there are agencies out there. And the good ones have care managers who can watch and react quickly when things are going sideways.
Further, what you were talking about, you just don't know. And there's so many things that can come up. So when my mom's health first crashed in June of 2018, I jumped in. And after her first hospitalization, we started they said, here's the company that we recommend. And I said, okay, can you give me another 2 or 3 names of companies? I want to interview them. I want to talk to them. I want to talk to the person who either founded it or is in charge. I want to ask so many questions. They were a little shocked because they're just so used to giving out, oh, this is the person, and then it just goes. So I learned a lot because I interviewed 4 companies at that point in time. And I had a lot of questions, and I learned a lot of questions to ask as I was going through that process as well.
All right.
It was new. So it was an interesting experience. And like you, I then learned, oh, there's so many things that could go wrong, because once we did bring somebody in, and there were at different times during the course of 2 years, we went through a number of different caregivers. It could have been a personality match. It wasn't there. It could have been we just didn't feel they understood the needs well, or we didn't feel they were really caring well. There were so many different aspects that could go wrong.
Yeah.
Looking back on your experience, both on the outside looking in, well, not on the outside looking in, and what you were talking about what you learned, how did that help or not help once you then started to become a caregiver?
That's such a great question. So I think the first thing that happened is I realized that finding a caregiver would not be the ultimate solution, that it wasn't going to be, and I did this once for my dad too, and we took forever to even find someone, that finding a caregiver is a part of helping the senior, but it's a big component that can go sideways very quickly, and it's not an easy solution. So I knew that while that may be part of what we needed to do, and we have done that, we have brought some care in place, it was going to be a process that needed to be managed very much hands-on. And that's why I've been here so much, because, and then there's so many, and we can talk about that for hours, all the other parts of taking care of a senior. It really helped me to understand that it's not a slam dunk. I could find the best agency out here and love their care manager and feel very comfortable. And still, as you saw, it could take weeks and months, depending on how particular I am. And every case is particular, right? Because it's your parent, and you want them to be happy and safe and well cared for, and as if you were there, but you can't be there all the time. So I think for me, it just taught me that I'm going to have to be very involved in that process. Or someone like me, if I wasn't here, I'd hire a geriatric care manager, but someone that's going to understand that it's not just finding a great agency. It's then that agency, and depending on the time, they may have a good caregiver, they may have made a great match, they may have made a bad match, and they may have to rematch. And you really need to be there as an advocate to make sure that that process it's never going to go completely smoothly, so that someone is there to manage when there are the hiccups. So I knew right away, no matter how much care we put in place, I'm going to have to come out here or hire someone who's here to help with that part of it.
In your journey with your mom, can you talk a little bit about how it started and then how it's changed? Because I understand that you were coming out every so often, and then how it becoming out often.
Yeah. So yeah, I used to always, and my mother was always like, the more time I have, the better. And I was at a point sometimes in my life where it's like, the less time I have, the better. But I still, felt a sense of obligation, and I like New York. So I would fly out for weekends, long weekends. I'd do a 3-day weekend, and I check in on the situation and, okay, everything looks okay. And then my brother moved up to once my dad got sick, and we still had a pretty good handle on things. My mother was in good shape, and I think that's what changes, and probably something you're experiencing too. When one spouse is a little younger, my mom was younger and healthier, it's not as much, you're not as involved, because my mother didn't want us as involved, right? I got it. Once my mother started to decline, and she was actually very active, 92-year-old, playing tennis, walking to the senior center. And they always say this, though, when someone at that age breaks their hips, things starts to go downhill. So she was walking back from the senior center exercise class. She got hit by a car, an 88-year-old driver, and she broke her hip. And once that happened, things started going downhill. And so my long weekends turned into more of 4, 5, up to a week. And what I started to realize also, that it wasn't only the care for my mother, it was supporting my brother, because he was here having to deal with this and deal with a less independent parent without the support. So I started spending more time. I started also becoming much more active with my power of attorney. So looking at all the accounts, that's the other part. That's the less sexy. Well, I wouldn't say anything sexy about it, but it's the, administrative part of it. Are you power of attorney? Do you have a healthcare proxy? Do you know what's going to happen to those accounts? So all of that stuff. So I started getting heavily involved into that earlier in the year, seeing that there was this decline. And then once starting in May and June, then I started saying, well, I actually need to be here much more often for my brother. So I became 1-week trips to 2-week trips to now I'm here going on 4 weeks, because we're entering this next journey, which is, many more health needs than before, and heading into hospice now. Still, she's feisty and stubborn, but we're definitely getting closer to that final chapter. So now it is, and it could be overwhelming, especially for my brother, who's more emotionally attached, is figuring out the landscape looks very different, and it changes by the day. It's one day you're like, okay, we need a little bit of care. Next day you're like, no, we need a lot of care.
Yeah, so true. So you and I both know that most often family caregivers become caregivers not thinking about it. It's a situation arises and you jump in and you try and figure out, okay, what am I doing next? And usually the first thing you're doing is just you're doing patient advocacy. You're calling doctors, you're going with them to doctors' appointments, you're reading lab tests, you're interpreting what's that, you're doing research, you're going to Google University and doing all you can to learn. And the caregiving's there, but you're trying to figure out what to do. So is there anything in your mind that anybody listening it might help to know, okay, what do you do first?
Well, I think the first thing is you make sure that you have everything in place before you get thrown into it. And I would love to say that we did that, but I'd be lying. We were lucky. But I think the first thing that you do is, and it's such a, it's such a delicate, it's a delicate dance, right? Because some parents fiercely hold on to that. And that was my fear, because my mother is so independent that she was going to be no, because a power of attorney is only effective if you can use it. If a parent won't let you use it, or doesn't even tell you they have it, you're really in trouble. So, my first line of I guess, advice would be, have that conversation as early as you can, as gently as you can, because forcing it, you're not going to get anywhere. So having the conversation, and I think I do a lot of storytelling, having the conversation through a story helps a lot. I can also tell you that people, when they get to the end of their life, they don't like talking about the end of their life. When it's earlier, and I've noticed this even with my mother, when it's much earlier than they anticipate their life will be, they're getting close to the end, it's a lot easier conversation. So one of the things that I found effective in hindsight is talking about my planning and my living will, my healthcare proxy, my power of attorney, to get people to have that conversation. So I have a 75-year-old half sister, and she doesn't have any of that in place. So and her daughter is getting very nervous because she's not in great health. And I told her my story. I'm going to get a power of attorney. I have it, but I'm, told her the story, and it became more palatable. So I think the first thing is to make sure, like, as you're talking about, all those conversations that you're having with doctors, they won't have with you unless you have a healthcare proxy. And the other thing I realize is that it's not only having it in place, there's also places that need their own healthcare, power of attorney signed. So any finances, good luck trying to get information. But it's really hard to have conversations on your parents' behalf if you don't have that in advance. If they don't authorize you to have those conversations, people won't talk to you. So I would say before anything happens, you have those you have that documentation in place.
Absolutely. I'd agree 100%. It was a leading question that I asked.
I know, because I know you've encountered it. But, and the one good thing is that you can tell the story to a doctor. That you can do without authorization, but they won't respond to you. They can't unless you have your authorization.
Yeah, it's a good point. I know from my parents. I can't say I knew before other than hearing about these things. But once my mom got sick, then it's, okay, where are your documents? What are your documents? And they did a good job. They had them. But to your point, the thing that I really learned, which you pointed out, was the doctors will talk to you when you're with them. But if you're not with them and you try and call, who are you?
Yeah.
We don't know who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so also the point about each facility and each entity needs their own documents. So you could have this power of attorney, you have this healthcare proxy, and you can send it to them, but they have special forms. So like Medicare, my parent, WellCare, the prescription drugs, CVS, doesn't matter, go on and on and on. Yeah. They all have their own documentation that they need.
And how many times I've had to wake up my mom and say, Mom, can you authorize them to talk to me? And she's she's half out of it and doesn't know what I'm talking about, then then the person I did the phone is, well, she doesn't sound like she knows what she's talking about. I'm like, well, you just made me wake her up. What do you So yeah, it's really complex. She was just in the hospital. And what I realize is that the hospital, the billing service is they needed authorization for each hospitalization. So, because they have their own form that hadn't been signed and needed to be notarized and all that stuff. So it was like, you're kidding. I said, all I want to do is pay a bill. I'm sorry, we can't talk to you, Miss Virginia.
When you were on the other side, on the industry side of the industry, what kind of things did you come across? Did you know all this, or how did you, are there some things that you just couldn't learn until you were sitting in that caregiver seat?
Yeah. So, absolutely. I learned it all sitting in the caregiving seat. However, I knew, and I would speak to a lot of long distance caregivers because they related to me because I was a long distance caregiver. And so oftentimes they were so overwhelmed. They were like, I don't even know where to start. And I would typically direct them in cases like that, where it was a long distance caregiving situation. I would refer them to a geriatric care manager because that person was the guide and could either do it on their behalf or help them to figure out next steps. So it's so interesting because I dabbled in it before, but not until I was living in it did I really, like, I was just talking to a lawyer here the other day, and I was saying, in the business, we used to always refer, we used to network with elder care attorneys and estate planners, not really knowing exactly what they did. And, but we knew we could get business from them and they can get business from us, period, end stop. Now that I'm here, I had a total aha moment. I was on the phone with a gentleman and a estate planning attorney here for my own situation. And I said, aha, I finally figured out what you guys do. And he was like, what are you talking about? You've been working with estate planners for 14 years. I said, yeah, but it was so superficial. And now I understand. And he did an audit review for me, for what wasn't a lot of money, looked at the documents and said, I just want to know, do we have everything in place? Is there going to be a situation when, when we get to that next place that I'm going to find out, oh, this is totally wrong, or thumbs up, this is right. I said, of course we can do that. And that's what his firm did. And then of course, in that process, you do say, well, we also need this, and you start to learn things. But yeah, walking the walk is really what helped me understand, because oftentimes, the geriatric care manager is the one that has that overarching understanding of what's going on. But we were providing caregivers. We were in the home care industry, not home health, home care, private pay. And we dealt with caregivers in the home. Knew a lot about the other stuff, but really it was it's complex enough to deal with caregivers, opening up that whole other thing about, just family dynamics and who has power of attorney and who's going to be handling those, and then handling those different aspects of care. It's a little overwhelming if it's one person, as you know.
Yes. So let's talk about HIPAA for a second, because this ties into the past two topics that we've been talking about. Trying to communicate with healthcare organizations and doctors and so forth, as well as the attorneys, and creating the documents that will allow them to talk and so forth. So how does that play? How did you see that on the industry side, and how do you see it as on the caregiving patient advocacy side?
So I think when I was on the industry side, all I cared about was the healthcare proxy, right? Power of attorney, who's going to be paying our bills? And home care, at least in the state of California, was not under HIPAA because it's considered non-medical. So we were one of the few providers that didn't really need it. It was good to have it because you need to know who's going to pay your bills ultimately, but we didn't need it. What I think opened up this whole other aspect for me was starting to deal with it because everybody else besides home care needs it. And you need your main document, as we just talked, you need your main healthcare proxy, power of attorney. Good to have a living will too, so you know what your senior wants to do at the end of life. But then all of those, any entity that you have to touch on your parents, we're saying, or your elders' behalf, is going to require some type of document that they will provide to you. But the amount of, if you can do that beforehand, you're ahead of the game. Because if you're trying to juggle, you have an, outdated bill or something that you don't understand. And then they're saying, I was telling someone, Macy's. I'm like, I'm trying to pay your bill and close the account on behalf of my mother. Can't talk. What do you want me to do? We need a copy of your power of attorney. Well, okay, you have to fax it. I don't have a fax machine. Well, then you have to mail it. I'm like, I don't have time to mail you a copy of I just want to pay the bill and close the account. So, I mean, finding out, collecting all of that information before, what do your parents' finances look like, or the senior's finances look like, and what do you have in place? And then what do you need to put in place? So your basic documents through the lawyers. If you want to do it yourself, good luck. I didn't have the patience to do it, but having your basic foundational document, and then seeing everybody else that your the senior is touching, and finding out, what do they need? What do you need to talk to me? Do you have a special document, or do you just need a copy of what I already have in place?
One of the things that I try and convey to people is that it's impossible to know what a caregiver and patient advocate has to do and deal with until you're a caregiver and patient advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to and I understand that now.
Yeah, because you're
yeah.
You're doing it.
Right. It's hard to comprehend how time consuming and all encompassing it is for all of these things. And we're just touching the surface.
My God. Oh.
Right. So it's an interesting one. And that leads me to my next topic. The primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.